Long before Babylon, long before mighty kings, empires, and armies, this land was already changing human history. Before us lies southern Mesopotamia, the plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. Today, we often imagine it as a dry and dusty land, but thousands of years ago, it was a living world of water. River branches, marshes, reed beds, seasonal floods, and fertile silt that renewed the soil year after year. It was here that people gradually learned not only to survive beside nature, but to control it. Water was no longer just a force of nature. It became a resource, a road, a weapon against hunger, and the foundation of an entirely new way of life. At first, there were only small settlements on raised ground near marshes and river channels. Mud brick houses, reed structures, animal pens, small fields beside the water. People grew barley, kept livestock, caught fish, traveled by boat, and lived according to the rhythm of the river. But this land had one defining feature. It could be incredibly fertile if water was directed correctly. A flood could bring life, but it could also destroy the harvest. Drought could take everything away. So people began digging canals, building embankments, distributing water between fields, and creating the first great infrastructure in human history. This was a quiet but radical transformation. When water began to flow where humans directed it, the landscape started to change. Wild floodplains turned into a mosaic of fields. Small villages grew larger. Grain stores appeared along with workshops, livestock yards, roads leading to canals, and spaces where people gathered crops, exchanged goods, and made collective decisions. This is how what we now call civilization began. Civilization did not appear in a single day. It did not begin with a royal palace or a great battle. It grew out of the need to coordinate. Someone had to clean the canal. Someone had to watch the water. Someone had to store the grain. Someone had to count how much had been collected, who owned what, and how many resources could be used for construction. From this order, the first cities slowly emerged. The most famous symbol of this world was Uruk, one of the first true cities on Earth. At the height of its rise, it was no longer just a large village. It was a dense urban organism with residential districts, temple complexes, storehouses, workshops, canals, open spaces, and areas where hundreds, perhaps thousands of people worked. From above, it becomes clear why this was such a new phenomenon. Around the city stretched fields, irrigation canals, smaller settlements, and waterways. Uruk did not exist by itself. It was the center of an entire system, drawing together the village, craft production, trade, religion, and labor. At the center of this world stood the temple complex. For the people of Mesopotamia, the temple was not only a place of worship, it was the economic, administrative, and symbolic heart of the city. Here, grain was stored, goods were received, labor was organized, resources were controlled, and the connection between earthly order and the world of the gods was maintained. That is why monumental platforms and temples rose above the low mud brick buildings. They showed that the city had a center, that it had authority, and that it had a shared idea for which people could work together. But the more complex the city became, the harder it was to manage. The memory of a single person was no longer enough. People had to count sacks of grain, jars of oil, livestock, labor, debts, and deliveries. Agreements had to be recorded. This is how early forms of writing appeared in Mesopotamia. The first records were not poetry, and they were not royal chronicles. They were practical. They were marks on clay about goods, quantities, accounting, and distribution. But from this everyday need came one of the most important inventions in human history. Humans learned to store information outside their own memory. History received a physical medium. While grain was being counted in administrative courtyards, craft production was alive in other parts of the city. Potters made vessels. Weavers worked with wool and textiles. Craftsmen shaped wood, reeds, stone, and metal, much of which had to be brought from distant lands. Mesopotamia was rich in silt, water, and grain, but it did not have every resource needed for a great civilization. So, trade became its bloodstream. Canals and rivers connected cities, villages, and distant regions. Boats carried grain, clay, textiles, livestock, and crafted goods. Donkey caravans arrived from the drier lands, bringing materials that could not be found in the marshy plain. The city was no longer an isolated point on a map. It became a node in a network, and it was this network that separated the first civilization from a mere large settlement. Babylon was still centuries away. Its greatness, its laws, its walls, and its legends belonged to another age. But the foundation had already been laid here, in southern Mesopotamia. Here, people created cities, learned to control water, organized labor, invented record-keeping, expanded trade, and built a society that could no longer exist without systems. This world was not perfect. It demanded hard labor, discipline, and dependence on the rivers. Canals had to be cleaned constantly. Fields could become salty. Cities needed more and more food, people, and control. But it was within this tension that a new model of human life was born. People no longer simply lived inside the landscape. They began to rewrite it. From above, this story can look almost simple. Rivers, fields, canals, settlements, a city. But behind that simplicity lies one of the greatest turning points in history. Because it was here that people first created a world in which much of our modern life already had its distant origins. The city, administration, writing, trade, division of labor, a center of power, an organized economy. Before Babylon, civilization already existed,